August 15, 1945, somewhere near Manila, Philippines. The war had ended. 23 women huddled in a cramped wooden barracks behind rusted barbed wire, their eyes hollow from years of unspeakable suffering. They'd heard rumors whispered through the walls, fragments of hope carried on the tropical wind. Japan had surrendered. American soldiers were coming. But after 3 years of betrayal, brutality, and broken promises, hope felt like a dangerous thing to hold. Then they heard it. The rumble of military trucks. American voices calling out in broken Tagalog and English. The metallic clang of gates being forced open. These women, stolen from their homes and forced into a nightmare they could never have imagined, were about to experience something they thought impossible: freedom. What followed was not just liberation, but a reckoning with humanity itself, a confrontation between the darkest chapters of war and the possibility of redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The system that ensnared these women began years before liberation, rooted in military strategy that treated human beings as expendable resources. In 1932, Japanese military planners faced a crisis of discipline. Soldiers stationed in occupied Manchuria were committing widespread assaults against local populations, creating diplomatic incidents and undermining military order. The solution they devised was not to improve discipline or accountability, but to institutionalize the very crimes they claimed to prevent. Military commanders established the first comfort stations, sanitized bureaucratic language that concealed brutal reality. Young women, primarily Korean at first, then Filipino, Chinese, Indonesian, and others from occupied territories, were recruited through deception, coercion, or outright kidnapping. Recruiters promised factory jobs, nursing positions, or opportunities to support their families through honest work. The reality waiting at the end of those promises was imprisonment in buildings guarded by soldiers, where women were forced to service dozens of men daily, under conditions that defied human comprehension. Maria Delgado, a 17-year-old seamstress from a small village outside Manila, remembered the day her life shattered with crystalline clarity even decades later. Japanese soldiers arrived in her village in early 1942, just months after occupying the Philippines. They announced they needed workers for a garment factory supporting the Imperial Army. The pay seemed generous, enough to help her family survive the hardships of occupation. Her mother begged her not to go, some maternal instinct sensing danger, but Maria believed she was making a sacrifice for her family's survival. She boarded a military truck with 11 other young women from surrounding villages. They traveled for 2 days, passing through checkpoints and military installations, their initial nervousness gradually transforming into dread as they moved farther from home and deeper into military-controlled territory. When the truck finally stopped, they were not at any factory. They were at a fortified compound surrounded by barbed wire, with armed guards at every entrance. The building inside was divided into small rooms, each containing only a thin mattress on bare floor. A Japanese officer explained their actual purpose with cold efficiency, his words delivered through a Filipino interpreter who could barely meet their eyes. The women were to serve the emperor by providing comfort to soldiers. Resistance would result in punishment. Escape was impossible. Their families had been paid, the officer lied, and would suffer consequences if the women failed to cooperate. That first night, Maria learned that words like comfort and service were masks for horror. The daily reality of the comfort stations operated with bureaucratic precision that made the brutality even more chilling. Women were given medical examinations, not for their health, but to ensure they would not transmit diseases to soldiers. They were assigned numbers. Maria became number 7. Soldiers received tickets purchased from station managers, color-coded by price and time allotment. A steady stream of men arrived each day, particularly before units deployed to combat zones or after they returned. Women serviced anywhere from 10 to 30 men daily, sometimes more on weekends or before major military operations. The physical toll was devastating. Injuries were common, infections frequent, pregnancies terminated by force. The psychological damage went deeper still, a systematic destruction of identity and dignity that left scars no medical examination could measure. Guards enforced absolute compliance. Women who resisted were beaten publicly as warnings to others. Those who attempted escape and were caught faced worse. The stations operated near military bases, far from civilian populations, making escape nearly impossible even if a woman could get past the guards. Where would she go? How would she survive an occupied territory with no papers, no money, no support? The isolation was as effective as the barbed wire and armed guards. Yet even in this darkness, small acts of resistance and humanity persisted. Women formed bonds with each other, creating makeshift families among fellow prisoners. They shared food when possible, tended each other's injuries, and held each other through night terrors. They whispered stories of home, keeping memories alive when everything else was being stripped away. Maria befriended a Korean woman named Sun Mi, who had been trapped in the system for 3 years already when Maria arrived. Sun Mi taught her how to mentally distance herself during the worst moments, how to hide small amounts of food, how to recognize which guards might show brief moments of humanity that could be leveraged for tiny mercies. These survival strategies made the difference between enduring and complete breakdown. The women developed a silent communication system, looks and gestures that conveyed warnings, support, or shared grief without words that guards might overhear. They sang quietly when allowed, songs from home that reminded them they had once been free. They marked time by scratching lines on walls, maintaining connection to the passage of days when each day felt eternal. These small acts of agency, maintaining some thread of self in circumstances designed to erase selfhood completely, represented profound courage. Some women found unexpected allies in unlikely places. Certain soldiers, usually older men or those less indoctrinated, showed brief flashes of human decency. They might speak gently, leave extra food, or simply treat the women as human beings rather than objects. These moments were rare glimmers in the darkness, reminding the women of their own humanity and offering a small measure of hope against an overwhelming despair. These moments were rare and dangerous for both parties. Soldiers who showed sympathy risked punishment from superiors who demanded strict maintenance of the system. Women who acknowledged kindness risked manipulation or worse. Yet these interactions mattered enormously, providing evidence that humanity still existed somewhere beyond the walls. Maria remembered one soldier, an older man who reminded her of her father, who visited the station regularly but spent his purchased time simply talking with her. He showed her photographs of his own daughter back in Japan, tears in his eyes as he whispered apologies for what was happening. He brought her medicine when she fell ill, risking severe punishment if discovered. He told her the war was going badly for Japan, that America was advancing, that liberation might come. She did not know whether to believe him, but his words planted seeds of hope she had thought dead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted dramatically. American forces were advancing through the Pacific, recapturing territory Japan had seized in the war's early years. As military situations deteriorated for Japanese forces, conditions in the comfort stations worsened correspondingly. Supply lines broke down, reducing food and medicine to almost nothing. Guards became more brutal, their frustration and fear translating into increased violence against the imprisoned women. Some stations were hastily abandoned as American forces approached, leaving women locked inside without food or water until local civilians discovered them days later. Other commanders, determined to hide evidence of the comfort system, ordered stations destroyed with women still inside. Some women were executed as Japanese units retreated, their captors eliminating witnesses to their crimes. In the Philippines specifically, the battle for Manila in early 1945 created chaos that was both terrifying and potentially liberating for women trapped in the system. Japanese forces, retreating in the face of American advance, committed horrific atrocities against Filipino civilians. The comfort stations existed in an uncertain space, some evacuated, others fortified, still others simply abandoned as military order collapsed. Maria's station remained operational through early August 1945, though conditions had deteriorated severely. Food arrived sporadically. Medical supplies were non-existent. The number of soldiers had decreased as units were deployed elsewhere, but those who remained were increasingly volatile, their brutality intensified by military setbacks and the knowledge that defeat was approaching. The women could hear distant artillery, the sounds of war creeping closer. Rumors circulated constantly. Japan was winning. Japan was losing. Americans were coming. Russians were coming. Nobody knew what to believe. The Japanese soldiers guarding the station grew nervous, their routine discipline cracking under stress. Guards argued among themselves, some advocating for evacuating the station, others insisting on maintaining operations until official orders arrived. On August 12th, most of the guards suddenly departed, leaving only a skeleton crew. The remaining soldiers seemed uncertain of their orders, their purpose, even their authority. They stopped enforcing the daily routine, leaving women confined to their rooms but otherwise unattended. For 3 days, the station existed in a strange limbo, neither operating nor liberated, as if the whole system had simply stopped functioning without any formal end. Then on August 15th came the announcement. Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast declaring Japan's surrender, his voice tinny and distant over a radio one guard had brought to the station's central room. The women could not understand Japanese well enough to follow the entire speech, but the guards' reactions told them everything. Some wept. Others sat in stunned silence. One threw his rifle down and walked away from the station entirely, simply disappearing into the surrounding countryside. That evening, the remaining guards gathered the women in the central courtyard. Through the interpreter who had stayed throughout, they delivered a brief statement. The war was over. They were leaving. The women should remain at the station because American forces would arrive soon. Then the guards departed, taking their weapons and leaving the gate unlocked. For the first time in years, no armed men stood between the women and freedom. Yet they did not immediately leave. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Where would they go? Were they truly free, or was this some kind of test or trap? The world beyond the wire had become foreign during their captivity. Home seemed impossibly distant, perhaps even more frightening than the familiar horror of the station. Maria stood at the open gate, staring at the dirt road leading away into darkness. Sun Mi stood beside her, and gradually the other women joined them, forming a cluster at the threshold between captivity and unknown freedom. They stayed there through the night, none quite able to take that final step, as if the invisible bars were stronger than the physical ones had ever been. Morning brought the rumble of engines. Military vehicles appeared on the road, American trucks and jeeps moving slowly, cautiously. Filipino scouts rode in the lead vehicles, calling out in Tagalog that they were liberation forces, that civilians should not be afraid. The convoy stopped when scouts spotted the women at the gate. Soldiers dismounted carefully, weapons lowered, approaching with obvious caution. These Americans had seen the aftermath of Japanese atrocities in Manila, had liberated prison camps where Allied soldiers and civilians had been held, but nothing had quite prepared them for this. Captain Robert Morrison of the 37th Infantry Division was among the first to approach the station. He spoke no Tagalog, but one of the Filipino scouts, Sergeant Carlos Reyes, served as translator. Morrison asked the women if they needed help, if they were injured, if Japanese soldiers were still present. The question seemed absurd to Maria. Where would she even begin to answer? How could she explain what had happened here in words that would make sense to these foreign soldiers who had never experienced this particular nightmare? Sun Mi, whose years in the system had given her a hardened directness the others lacked, stepped forward and spoke to Sergeant Reyes in broken English mixed with Tagalog. She explained what the station was, what had been done to them. She used simple, brutal words because euphemisms no longer had meaning. Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to horror as the translation unfolded. He turned to his radio operator and called for medical support, female nurses specifically, and representatives from Allied civilian affairs. He ordered his men to establish a secure perimeter around the station, but to stay outside the fence unless specifically needed inside. He understood, intuitively, that armed men approaching these women would be traumatic regardless of nationality or intent. The first American nurse to arrive, Lieutenant Sarah Blackwell, brought supplies and reinforcements from a field hospital. She approached the women slowly, speaking in a gentle voice, explaining that she was there to help, that they were safe now, that nobody would hurt them anymore. The words seemed inadequate, even hollow, but she repeated them anyway, because what else could she offer except consistent, patient demonstration of good intent? She brought food, real food, not the rice and scraps they had survived on. She brought clean water and medical supplies. She brought blankets, because despite the tropical heat, several women were shivering uncontrollably. Most importantly, she brought the first possibility of trust these women had encountered in years. Maria watched Lieutenant Blackwell move among them, checking injuries, offering water, simply sitting beside women too traumatized to speak. The kindness felt dangerous, another potential betrayal waiting to unfold. Yet gradually, hesitantly, the women began to accept help. They drank the water. They ate the food. They allowed nurses to examine their injuries, the first tiny steps toward believing they might actually be free. Over the following days, the liberation transformed from immediate rescue to the enormously complex task of helping these women begin to rebuild shattered lives. Military authorities established a temporary shelter at a former school building in Manila, where women from multiple comfort stations were brought together. Medical teams, Filipino civilian workers, and American military nurses collaborated to provide care that went beyond treating physical injuries. The psychological trauma required different approaches, different patience. Some women spoke compulsively about their experiences, needing to tell their stories to someone who would listen and believe. Others retreated into complete silence, unable or unwilling to articulate what they had endured. Social workers and chaplains worked to locate surviving family members, though this process revealed new heartbreaks. Some families, devastated by war themselves, could not be found. Others had moved, evacuated, or perished during the occupation. A few families rejected returning daughters, the shame and stigma of what had happened making reunion impossible. This rejection represented perhaps the cruelest betrayal, discovering that survival and freedom did not automatically mean restoration to the lives stolen years before. Maria learned that her parents had died during the Battle of Manila, killed when their neighborhood became a battlefield between retreating Japanese forces and advancing Americans. Her younger brother had survived and was living with relatives in a refugee camp. Their reunion was joyful and heartbreaking simultaneously. He had grown from a child into a young man during her absence. He knew, vaguely, that something terrible had happened to her, but not the details. She decided she would never tell him the full truth, a burden she would carry alone.
Sun Mi faced different challenges. She was Korean, thousands of miles from home, in a country still under Japanese occupation even after surrender. Repatriation would take months of bureaucratic processing, during which she existed in limbo. American authorities eventually arranged transport for Korean comfort women to return home, but Sun Mi chose to remain in the Philippines. Home held too many painful memories, too much shame in a culture that would blame victims rather than perpetrators. She built a new life in Manila, working as a translator for American relief organizations, creating an identity separate from both her past and the country she could never return to. The broader recognition of what had happened to these women unfolded slowly and inadequately. Allied authorities documented the comfort station system as they encountered it across the Pacific. War crimes trials in Tokyo included testimony from comfort women, though their experiences received far less attention than atrocities against Allied prisoners of war. Many perpetrators were never prosecuted, their crimes considered less significant than battlefield atrocities, or simply lost in the overwhelming volume of war crimes requiring investigation. The women themselves often chose silence over public acknowledgement. Speaking openly meant identifying themselves as former comfort women, inviting stigma and shame from communities that preferred not to confront uncomfortable truths. For decades, the comfort women system existed as a footnote in war histories, acknowledged but not deeply examined, affecting hundreds of thousands of women across Asia whose stories remained largely untold. Maria rebuilt her life, piece by piece, with determination that amazed those who knew her story. She learned secretarial skills at a vocational program established by American relief organizations. She found work at a trading company in Manila's business district. She married a kind man who knew nothing of her past and never asked about the years she did not discuss. She had 3 children and became a grandmother. She lived a full life by any external measure, achieving normalcy that seemed impossible during those years behind barbed wire. Yet the past never disappeared entirely. Certain sounds, certain smells, even certain times of day could trigger memories that crashed through her present like waves. She suffered nightmares throughout her life, waking in terror from dreams she could not remember, but that left her shaking and gasping. She developed coping mechanisms, ways of managing the trauma that allowed her to function but never fully heal. She found strength in small rituals, daily routines that affirmed her freedom and agency. Making choices about what to eat, where to go, how to spend her time. These ordinary decisions represented extraordinary victories over a past designed to strip away all choice. She lived deliberately, consciously creating meaning and purpose from survival itself.
Several women had been wounded by shrapnel, yet they had survived, huddled in makeshift shelters, waiting for the fighting to end. Lieutenant Commander Helen Rodriguez, a Navy nurse assigned to the Okinawa occupation, spent weeks working with these survivors. She documented their stories, not for official reports, but because she believed someone needed to bear witness. Her personal journals, discovered decades later, provided invaluable first-hand accounts of the liberation process and the immediate aftermath. Rodriguez wrote about the difficulty of establishing trust with women who had learned that trust led to betrayal. She described the patience required, the slow building of rapport through consistent kindness and respect. She noted that the women often helped each other more effectively than any external assistance could, their shared experience creating understanding that outsiders could never fully achieve. In the Dutch East Indies, Australian forces liberating Java encountered comfort stations holding Indonesian, Dutch, and Chinese women. The Australian military response differed slightly from American approaches, influenced by their own experiences with Japanese prisoner of war camps. Australian soldiers had suffered terribly in captivity, and they brought that understanding to their treatment of liberated comfort women. Major Catherine Sullivan, an Australian Army nurse, established specialized recovery facilities specifically for these women, separate from general refugee populations. She recognized that their needs were unique, requiring approaches different from standard war refugee assistance. Sullivan advocated for long-term support rather than immediate repatriation, understanding that returning home did not equal recovery. She fought military bureaucracy to secure extended care, arguing that abandoning these women after liberation would represent a continuation of their victimization. Her efforts created models that other Allied units attempted to replicate, though resource constraints often limited implementation. The work was exhausting and emotionally devastating. Sullivan's letters home revealed the toll of witnessing so much suffering while having inadequate resources to address it properly. Yet she persisted, driven by conviction that these women deserved every possible effort toward recovery. The process of helping comfort women rebuild identities destroyed by years of systematic dehumanization required approaches that medical and psychological professionals of 1945 were only beginning to understand. Trauma psychology as a formal discipline barely existed. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be formally recognized for another 3 decades. Caregivers worked largely through intuition and compassion, developing treatments through trial and observation. Some approaches proved remarkably effective despite the lack of formal theoretical framework. Art therapy, though not called that at the time, emerged naturally as women were given materials and encouraged to draw or paint. The creative process provided outlets for emotions too complex or painful for words. Support groups formed organically as women chose to gather and share experiences. Professional facilitators learned to guide these sessions with light touches, allowing the women themselves to direct conversations and establish boundaries.
Physical work, gardening particularly, became therapeutic as women engaged with soil and growing things, nurturing life as a counterpoint to their experiences with destruction and death. Religious and spiritual practices offered comfort to some women, though others rejected faith entirely after what they had endured. Filipino Catholic women sometimes found solace in prayer and confession, though the Church's response to their experiences was often inadequate and occasionally harmful. Priests uncomfortable with the reality of sexual violence sometimes offered platitudes about forgiveness and suffering that felt like additional burdens rather than comfort. Buddhist women from Korea and China engaged in meditation practices that helped quiet traumatized minds. Some women created their own spiritual frameworks, combining elements from various traditions with personal beliefs forged through survival. The diversity of approaches reflected the fundamental truth that healing was deeply individual. What helped one woman might harm another. Effective caregivers learned to offer options and support without imposing predetermined paths to recovery. Material support proved essential alongside emotional and psychological care. Women needed practical assistance rebuilding their lives in concrete ways. Vocational training programs taught skills that could lead to employment and financial independence. Literacy classes served those whose education had been interrupted by war and captivity. Small business loans helped women establish shops or services, creating economic stability. Housing assistance provided safe places to live, essential for women whose families could not or would not accept their return. These practical interventions addressed the reality that survival required more than healing trauma. Women needed to eat, to shelter, to support themselves and often children or other family members. The intersection of psychological recovery and practical survival created complex challenges requiring coordinated responses across multiple support systems. Lieutenant Sarah Blackwell, the nurse who had first approached Maria and the other women at their comfort station, made a decision that would alter her career and life trajectory. She requested extended assignment in the Philippines specifically to continue working with comfort women survivors. She learned Tagalog and basic Korean. She trained Filipino nurses and social workers in trauma-informed care approaches she was developing through practice. She established a clinic in Manila that provided ongoing medical and psychological support specifically for former comfort women, funded initially through military channels and later through charitable organizations. Blackwell's work continued long after most military personnel had returned home. She married a Filipino doctor she met during her service and remained in the Philippines permanently. Her clinic operated for 37 years, serving generations of women whose trauma from the comfort station experience echoed through decades. Blackwell's personal papers, donated to a university archive after her death, revealed the depth of her commitment and the toll the work exacted. She suffered vicarious trauma from absorbing so many horrific stories. She struggled with anger at systems that had failed to protect these women or adequately punish perpetrators. Yet her notes consistently returned to themes of hope and resilience, documenting the remarkable strength women demonstrated in rebuilding their lives.
Maria's relationship with Lieutenant Blackwell evolved from patient and caregiver to something approaching friendship, though the power dynamics and cultural differences always created some distance. Blackwell encouraged Maria to journal about her experiences, not for any official purpose, but as a tool for processing trauma. Maria initially resisted, fearing that writing would make the memories more permanent somehow. Eventually, she began, tentatively at first, then with increasing urgency. The journals filled notebooks stored in a locked trunk, words she never intended anyone else to read but needed to externalize. Decades later, after Maria's death, her daughter discovered the journals. The decision about what to do with them created family turmoil. Some relatives wanted them destroyed, the past buried permanently. Others believed the historical record mattered, that bearing witness to atrocities served important purposes. Eventually, with appropriate redactions to protect privacy, portions were shared with researchers studying the comfort women's system. Maria's detailed accounts provided invaluable perspectives on daily life in the stations, the survival strategies women employed, and the long process of recovery. Her words, preserved across decades, became testimony on behalf of countless women who never had opportunity or ability to document their experiences. The geopolitical context of post-war Asia complicated efforts to achieve justice or even acknowledgement for comfort women. The emerging Cold War created priorities that superseded war crimes prosecution. American occupation authorities in Japan, focused on rebuilding the country as a bulwark against communism, chose not to aggressively pursue many categories of war crimes, including the comfort women's system. Documents were classified, evidence suppressed, testimony ignored. Japanese officials involved in establishing and operating comfort stations faced minimal consequences. Some returned to prominent positions in post-war government and business. The institutional memory of what had been done to women across Asia was deliberately obscured, deemed less important than strategic considerations of the present. This failure of justice represented a continuation of the victimization in different form. Women who had suffered terribly were told their experiences mattered less than political expediency. The message was clear. What happened to them would not be fully acknowledged, perpetrators would not be held accountable, and their suffering would be minimized in official histories. For decades, this remained the status quo. Comfort women who survived struggled quietly with their trauma, most choosing silence over the social stigma of public identification. The historical record treated the comfort station system as a footnote, mentioned briefly, if at all, in accounts of the Pacific War. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, something shifted. Surviving comfort women in Korea, the Philippines, China, and other affected countries began speaking publicly about their experiences. Their testimony was difficult to hear and impossible to ignore. Kim Hak-sun, a Korean survivor, gave the first public testimony in 1991, breaking decades of silence. Her courage inspired others. John Ruffel Hearn, a Dutch-Australian survivor, published her memoir in 1994, bringing Western attention to Asian women's experiences.
Gradually, against resistance from Japanese nationalist politicians who denied the comfort system's existence or claimed participation was voluntary, survivors built a movement demanding acknowledgement, apology, and compensation. Maria watched these developments from the Philippines with complex emotions. She admired the courage of women speaking publicly, but could never imagine doing so herself. She had built a life predicated on moving forward, and public testimony felt like stepping backward into trauma she had spent decades learning to manage. Yet she supported the movement in quiet ways. She donated anonymously to organizations supporting elderly survivors. She attended private gatherings where former comfort women shared experiences away from public scrutiny. She wrote letters to the editor under pseudonyms, arguing for historical acknowledgement without identifying her personal connection. Her family remained largely unaware of her past until near the end of her life. Only then, sensing time was limited, did she tell her eldest daughter the full story. The revelation was devastating. Her daughter struggled to reconcile the grandmother she knew, this strong woman who had raised her with such love, with the suffering described. Yet the conversation also brought a sense of completeness, missing pieces of family history finally falling into place. The healing journeys of comfort women survivors demonstrated that recovery from severe trauma is not linear. Progress occurred in fits and starts, good periods followed by setbacks, revelations followed by retreats. Anniversary reactions were common, dates associated with traumatic events triggering symptoms even decades later. Certain sensory experiences, smells or sounds, could provoke flashbacks. Relationships were complicated, intimacy difficult for women whose sexuality had been weaponized against them. Yet many women built loving relationships despite these challenges. They found partners patient enough to navigate the complexities. They raised children with fierce protectiveness, determined to create childhoods radically different from their own traumatic young adulthood. They forged communities of support with other survivors, bonds formed through shared experience that outsiders could never fully understand. These relationships became lifelines, spaces where the women could be fully themselves without pretense or explanation. Sunmi, who had chosen to remain in the Philippines rather than return to Korea, built a particularly remarkable life of service. After working as a translator, she established a nonprofit organization helping refugees and displaced persons navigate bureaucratic systems. Her own experience of displacement informed her work. She understood the psychological impact of losing home, family, identity. She guided hundreds of people through the complex processes of obtaining documents, finding housing, securing employment. Her organization eventually expanded to provide services specifically for women escaping violence, a natural extension of her personal journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Sunmi never married, but she created a chosen family of colleagues and clients whose lives she touched. She became a beloved figure in Manila's social service community, known for her toughness, her refusal to accept bureaucratic obstacles, and her deep compassion for people struggling with trauma. When she died at age 72, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had changed. Many learned only then about her background as a comfort woman, a part of her history she had kept private while channeling her experiences into helping others. The question of reparations and official acknowledgement continued to divide nations and survivors themselves. Some women demanded formal apologies and compensation from the Japanese government. Others wanted acknowledgement without financial payment, believing money could not address what had been stolen. Still others simply wanted to be left alone, their privacy protected, their desire to move forward respected. Japanese government responses evolved slowly and inadequately. Limited compensation funds were established, but without accepting legal responsibility. Official statements expressed regret, but avoided direct apology. History textbooks in Japan minimized or omitted the comfort woman system, perpetuating ignorance among younger generations. Meanwhile, nationalist politicians continued denying the system's coercive nature, claiming women had been willing participants. These denials added fresh pain to old wounds. telling survivors that even after speaking out, their testimony would be questioned. International pressure gradually increased through the 1990s and early 2000s. United Nations reports condemned the comfort woman system as crimes against humanity. Governments, including the United States House of Representatives, passed resolutions calling for Japan to acknowledge historical facts and apologize formally. Memorials were erected in multiple countries, physical monuments to experiences that some wished to forget, but many needed to remember. Museums incorporated comfort woman history into exhibits about World War II. Academic conferences examined the system from historical, legal, and human rights perspectives. What had been hidden or minimized became increasingly difficult to ignore. The survivors who had broken silence created space for broader reckoning with uncomfortable historical truths. Their courage in testifying publicly despite social stigma and political pressure demonstrated resilience far beyond mere survival. Maria lived long enough to see these changes, though she maintained her privacy to the end. She died in 2007 at age 82, surrounded by family who loved her without fully understanding what she had survived. Her funeral was traditional Filipino Catholic, the church full of relatives, friends, and neighbors who knew her as devoted mother, loving grandmother, and active community member. Only a handful of people present knew her complete story. Lieutenant Sarah Blackwell, by then quite elderly herself, attended and delivered a eulogy that honored Maria's strength without revealing details she had kept private. Blackwell spoke about resilience, courage, and the remarkable capacity of human spirit to transcend even the darkest experiences. Those who knew Maria's full story understood the specific reference. Those who did not heard universal truths about overcoming adversity. After the funeral, Blackwell placed a small stone on Maria's grave, a Korean tradition Sunmi had taught her. Each stone representing a story carried forward, a memory preserved, a life that mattered.
The legacy of comfort women survivors extends far beyond their individual stories. Their experiences illuminated the particular vulnerabilities women face during war, the ways conflict creates conditions for systematic sexual violence. Their testimony contributed to evolving international law regarding war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court explicitly includes rape, sexual slavery, and forced prostitution as crimes against humanity, language influenced by comfort women advocacy. Contemporary efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence in Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, and elsewhere reference comfort women experiences as historical precedent. The survivors became, often reluctantly, symbols of resistance against impunity. Their insistence on acknowledgement and justice, despite facing powerful forces determined to maintain silence, demonstrated that individual voices demanding truth could eventually pierce institutional resistance. For younger generations of women across Asia and globally, comfort women survivors represent something beyond historical victims. They exemplify the possibility of reclaiming agency after it has been stripped away. They demonstrate that speaking truth to power matters even when immediate results seem unlikely. They show that healing is possible even from severe trauma, though the scars remain. They prove that survival itself can be an act of resistance. Educational programs now teach comfort women history in contexts of human rights, women's rights, and wartime accountability. Students learn not only what happened, but why it matters for contemporary issues. The connections between historical atrocity and present-day sexual violence become clear. The importance of believing survivors, supporting victims, and demanding accountability resonates across decades. The physical spaces where comfort stations existed have largely disappeared. Some were destroyed during the war, others were demolished in post-war reconstruction. A few remain, repurposed for other uses, unmarked and unremarkable. Efforts to preserve or memorialize these sites have met resistance from property owners and governments preferring not to highlight uncomfortable history.
Yet even without physical markers, the experiences that occurred in those spaces remain present in collective memory, carried forward through testimony, documentation, and determination that such atrocities never be repeated. The challenge is ensuring memory persists as the generation with direct experience passes. The last comfort women survivors are now in their 90s or have died. Soon there will be no living witnesses. What then? Will the stories fade into academic footnotes, taught briefly if at all? Or will the courage these women demonstrated in breaking silence create lasting change in how societies address sexual violence during conflict? The answer depends partly on those who carry the stories forward, researchers, educators, advocates, and family members who recognize the importance of this history. But it also depends on broader societal willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about what humans do to each other during war.
Understanding this history means acknowledging that capacity for such cruelty exists within human societies, and that preventing future atrocities requires active commitment to justice, accountability, and human dignity. The survivors who testified despite enormous personal cost gave a gift to future generations, the gift of knowledge purchased with great suffering. Honoring that gift means ensuring their stories continue to be heard, their experiences continue to inform efforts to build more just societies, and their courage continues to inspire those facing their own struggles for dignity and recognition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.